I want to introduce you to someone who will catch you completely off guard, just like he caught me. Let me describe him. His mother was visited by a celestial messenger while she was still carrying him. The messenger told her, "The child you will bear is no ordinary human." When the child was born, extraordinary signs appeared in the sky. And then it continues. He grew up and became a wandering teacher. He healed the sick. He drove out malevolent spirits. According to the sources, he restored those who had passed back to the living. His followers called him the Son of God. Was someone that prominent really going to go unnoticed? The Roman authorities arrested him and threw him in a cell. But when the guards came to his cell one morning, it was empty. His followers declared, "He has ascended to the heavens, and he will return." Now let me ask you, who am I talking about? The person everyone thinks of, the same person I thought of first. Who? If your answer is Jesus, then you, just like me, are wrong. Is this funny? Sad? Shocking? I honestly can't name the feeling. This question is not being asked for the first time. American scholar Bart Ehrman has been running this exact experiment in his university lectures for years. He describes a man who lived in the 1st century, a celestial birth, miracles, healing, and unjust trial, and ascension to the heavens. The class always gives the same answer, Jesus, and Ehrman always corrects them the same way. No, Apollonius of Tyana. The fact that this experiment still works 2,000 years later tells you the most important thing you need to know about history. It tells you that the past is not a fixed record, it is a story told by those who prevailed. The winner fills the past with his own story and erases the loser's name. The very fact that you have never heard of the man I am about to describe is itself the most powerful evidence of how this works. Based on my research, this man's name is Apollonius. His birthplace is Tyana, right in the heart of modern Turkey, in the very center of Anatolia, in the Kemerhisar district of Niğde, 1st century AD, the golden age of the Roman Empire. And this Niğde has such extraordinary ancient sites that you can't help but be amazed. In my opinion, the most remarkable is the world's first and only non-sorrowful, smiling fresco of the Virgin Mary with a smiling infant Jesus in her arms. This fresco is in the Gümüşler monastery in the Gümüşler village of Niğde. It dates back to the Byzantine period, a time when this region was a crossroads of faith and empire, where Christian and pre-Christian worlds overlapped in ways that most people today have completely forgotten. Right in front of the fresco stand 2 columns. If you look from behind the right column, they seem to turn and look at you. If you look from behind the left column, they seem to turn and look at you from the other side. It is one of those rare works of art that does not simply sit on a wall, it engages with you. Such a masterpiece that I witnessed it with my own eyes when I visited. And standing there, in that quiet monastery in the heart of Anatolia, knowing that the man we are about to discuss was born just a few miles away, that is a feeling I cannot easily describe. Now, to go deeper into our subject, Apollonius was active approximately between 65 and 85 AD. Make a note of those dates because they almost perfectly overlap with the period that biblical scholars place the public life of Jesus. 2 men walking the same roads of the same empire in the same decades. Is that even possible? And here's the strange part. In his own time, Apollonius was far more well known than Jesus. across every corner of the Roman Empire, from Spain to Syria, from Egypt to Greece, people knew his name. Temples consulted him, governors listened to him, emperors feared him. He was one of Rome's most recognized figures. I'll be honest, I had never heard of him either until I started this research. While a governor in the farthest corner of Rome was writing a letter to Apollonius, the name of Jesus had not yet echoed through the streets of that city. But today, billions of people know the name of Jesus. Almost no one has heard of Apollonius. Two men who lived nearly identical lives in the same century, in the same geography. From their celestial births to their miracles, from their trials to the manner in which they departed the physical world, the list of parallels goes on and on. But the outcomes are the exact opposite. One became God, the other was erased from history. How did that happen? These similarities don't diminish the reality of either man, quite the opposite. In my view, they reveal just how desperately that era's spirit was searching for a savior. Whatever sense of loss, whatever chaos people were living through, they clung to the hope they found with everything they had, deeply and fiercely. And beyond all of this, yet another character persecuted because the authorities believed he threatened their power. Whether these two were the same person or different people, the contrast between how ordinary people looked at them and how the authorities looked at them matters deeply to me. Tonight, we will chase these questions. Why are these two lives so similar? Was one copied of the other? Or perhaps there was a holy man template that everyone in the first century Roman world already knew, and both men simply fit that template. And perhaps most importantly, if both men lived nearly identical lives, what force determined which one would be remembered forever and which one would be buried in silence? The answer may be more disturbing than you think, because this story isn't just about two men, it's about how history gets written, who gets remembered, and who gets forgotten. But first, let's start from the beginning. Let's begin at the very point where it all started. Everything we know about Apollonius is based on the writings of a single man. Around 220 AD, a writer named Philostratus composed this massive biography. But the reason this book was written was not simply admiration. This work was commissioned by the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire, Empress Julia Domna herself. Think about it. In the deepest chambers of the palace, the woman at the pinnacle of the empire, why would she want the life of a man who lived 100 years earlier, documented down to the finest detail? Was this merely a biography, or was it an operation to create Rome's own holy man against a rising new faith? This is where the dustiest and most dangerous shelves of the archive open up. Julia Domna was a woman who had risen from the city of Emesa in Syria to the very top of Rome, the most powerful intellectual patron of her era, a figure who gathered philosophers, writers, and historians in her court. And one day she gave Philostratus a mission: write the life of Apollonius. Philostratus says he relied on two sources for this task. The first, journals allegedly kept by Apollonius's traveling companion, a man named Demas. The second, stories told about Apollonius in cities and records preserved in temples. The existence of Demas is fascinating in itself, a traveling companion who recorded the holy man's life. Does that concept sound familiar? In the New Testament, the life of Jesus is conveyed by his followers: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. 4 different perspectives, 4 different narrators. Apollonius had a single Demas, but the function is the same:
carrying the holy man's life into the future through testimony. How reliable these sources are has been debated for centuries, but the story Philostratus tells is undeniably striking, and it all begins with a birth. According to the sources, a divine being appeared to Apollonius's mother while she was still carrying him. Proteus, a shape-shifting, future-seeing figure from the Egyptian pantheon. The mother asked, "What will I bear?" The answer was, "Me." Think about the weight of that single word. The divine being doesn't say a prophet or a great man, he says, "Me." The child to be born would be the divine being itself. When the child was born, extraordinary signs appeared in the sky. Philostratus describes lightning flashing and then vanishing in an instant. Nature paused for a moment, as if the world recognized the one who had arrived. Now stop. Let's place this scene side by side with the biblical narratives. According to the Gospel of Matthew, an angel appeared to Mary while she was carrying her child, and delivered the news the child to be born would be no ordinary person. The Gospel of Luke elaborates further. The angel's name is Gabriel, and his message is clear. The one to be born will be holy and will be called the Son of God.
When the birth occurred, a star appeared in the sky. Wise men from the east, the Magi, followed this star to Bethlehem. Shepherds were awakened by a chorus of angels. The heavens were celebrating. Two birth stories, two celestial messengers, two extraordinary events in the sky. And between the two narratives, a structural overlap that is nearly perfect. It's hard to ignore this. One birth story could be a coincidence. One celestial messenger could be a fluke. But both together, the same structure, the same sequence, the same message, points to something beyond coincidence. Yes, Philostratus wrote this work at least 150 years after the Gospel writers. This is a very important detail that cannot be ignored. Critics rightly ask, could Philostratus have simply dressed Apollonius in the already well-known Gospel narratives? Perhaps. But notice, Philostratus is telling the life of Apollonius, not his own era. The man he's describing lived in the same decades as Jesus, and the birth story of Apollonius may well have been circulating in the Roman world long before Philostratus. Apollonius was a legend in his own time, and the birth stories of legends begin to take shape during the hero's own lifetime, not centuries later. Moreover, certain details in Philostratus's account are clearly different from the Gospels. The Proteus figure is Egyptian in origin. It has no counterpart in the Christian tradition. The nature of the celestial events differs. This suggests that Philostratus was not simply copying. He was drawing, at least in part, from a different tradition. Apollonius's birthplace, Tyana, was a small Anatolian city in the region of Cappadocia. If you go there today, the Kemedhisar district of Niğde, you'll see a few ancient foundation ruins and a flat plain. 2,000 years ago, this was a bustling center of trade and culture on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. Branches of the Silk Road passed through here. Knowledge from the east and power from the west met on this land. And the child who emerged from this land would one day become one of the most talked about names in the empire. But the birth story alone wasn't enough. There were no shortage of figures in the Roman world who claimed celestial births, from Romulus and Remus to Augustus. What set Apollonius apart was the life he lived after his birth, because this man would embrace one of the most radical ways of living Rome had ever seen.
At a young age, Apollonius turned to Pythagorean philosophy. Pythagoreanism was a school of thought founded by Pythagoras in the 6th century BC. But this wasn't just a philosophy, it was a way of life, a disciplined path with strict rules, as much a belief system as it was a system of thought. Neo-Pythagoreanism, the renewed form of this tradition that Apollonius followed, was built on 3 core beliefs. First, the universe is eternal, uncreated, and will never cease to exist. Second, the human soul does not perish but migrates between bodies. Third, strict discipline is essential to understand and transcend this cycle. And Apollonius embraced this discipline to its fullest. In the words of the encyclopedic sources, he wore only linen garments. Nothing made from animal skin or wool ever touched his body. Why linen? Because linen comes from plants. It is not an animal product. In the Pythagorean belief, animals also carry souls, because the soul migrates. To wear the wool of an animal was to potentially touch the vessel of another soul.
According to this belief, no soul in the world is ever lost. It only changes form. A being that is human today may have been an animal in a previous life. In a future life, it will take another form. This is why respect for all living creatures is the foundation of Pythagorean teaching. By the same logic, he completely gave up eating meat. He opposed animal sacrifice. According to the sources, he said, "Do you want to make offerings to the gods? They don't need offerings of the sacred life essence. They need wisdom. The most valuable thing to the gods is the human mind." Think about that statement for a moment. In the 1st century, animals were being sacrificed in temples across every corner of the Roman Empire. This ritual was the religion itself, and Apollonius was openly opposing it. To say the gods want wisdom, not sacrifice, was an extraordinarily radical stance for that era. He never married. He kept himself apart from physical desires. The encyclopedic sources describe celibacy as a counsel of perfection. In the Pythagorean tradition, disciplining the body was the prerequisite for liberating the soul. And the most striking of all, he did not speak for 5 years. 5 full years, days, weeks, months, he lived without uttering a single word. In the Pythagorean tradition, this silence was not merely discipline, it was a rite of passage. According to the belief, when you stop speaking, you begin to truly hear the world. The veil created by words lifts. The voice of reality, the harmony of numbers, planets, the universe, can only be heard then. Silence was not a punishment. Silence was a doorway. Now, let's compare once more. In the biblical narratives, there is almost no information about the childhood and youth of Jesus. He is seen at age 12 debating scholars in the temple, and then he vanishes. There is an 18-year gap until he appears before the public at around 30. Some scholars discuss whether Jesus may have lived some kind of ascetic life during this gap, perhaps spending time with desert communities. Apollonius, on the other hand, has no lost years. Every step of his journey is documented, at least according to Philostratus. After his years of silence, Apollonius took to the road. At his side was a traveling companion named Damis, an Assyrian. Damis was a chronicler who supposedly recorded his life day by day. These notes later became one of the main sources Philostratus used when writing the biography. At least, that's what Philostratus claims.
Apollonius first went to Antioch, one of the most cosmopolitan cities of its time, the intellectual center at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, a city where Greek philosophy met Syrian mysticism in the marketplaces. Then he traveled to Babylon, the cradle of ancient wisdom, the homeland of Chaldean astrologers and mathematicians, a place that even in the 1st century still carried the weight of millennia of accumulated knowledge. Then he continued eastward, reaching as far as India to meet with the Brahmins and listen to the wisdom of the East.
This journey alone is remarkable. In the 1st century, traveling from one end of the Roman Empire to the other must have taken weeks, sometimes months. Roads were dangerous. Bandits, storms, disease, every mile was a risk. Apollonius undertook this not merely as a physical journey, but as a spiritual quest. At every stop, he learned something new. At every temple, he touched a new form of wisdom. He was not simply collecting information. He was assembling a worldview that drew from every civilization the ancient world had to offer. Then he returned and began teaching in the greatest cities of the Roman world: Ephesus, Athens, Rome, Alexandria. Wherever he went, crowds gathered. He spoke in temples, he debated in public squares, and according to the sources, it was said that the philosopher stood between the gods and men. Not fully a god, not fully a man, somewhere in between, a bridge. And people listened, not just ordinary people, governors, priests, philosophers. He was summoned as a consultant to temples. He served as a mediator in disputes between cities. Rome's most elite intellectual circles accepted him. Apollonius was no longer just a wandering philosopher. He had become one of the most respected voices in the Roman world. And here, once again, a parallel emerges. Jesus, too, created the same effect wherever he preached. He gathered crowds, captivated his listeners, and the authorities perceived him as a threat. Charismatic leadership in the ancient world was both a gift and a curse. The same fame that elevated you also brought you face to face with enemies. Consider this. A man who had not spoken a single word for 5 years becomes the most listened to voice in the empire the moment he breaks his silence. It's as though the silence had given him something, an authority, a depth that ordinary people did not possess. When he spoke, people didn't just listen, they submitted. And at precisely this point, we need to move to the next layer of the story, because what Apollonius did was not limited to speaking. This is exactly where the story goes beyond that of an ordinary philosopher. Apollonius didn't just speak. According to the sources, he healed people, he confronted malevolent spirits, and according to Philostratus' account, he restored a young woman who had passed back to her feet. Let me relay the scene. A funeral procession in Rome, a family in mourning, a young woman being carried through the streets. Apollonius stopped the procession. He approached the young woman, whispered something, and according to the sources, she opened her eyes. Even Philostratus is cautious when relaying this moment. He says perhaps he truly brought her back, or perhaps he discovered a spark of life that had not yet been extinguished, something the physicians had failed to notice. He narrates it while preserving the ambiguity, but he narrates it, and the impression left in the reader's mind is clear. This was no ordinary philosopher. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar stories recur throughout Philostratus's account. In Ephesus, during a threat of plague, Apollonius came to the city square and, according to the sources, identified the source of the illness. In another account, he freed a young man who was under the influence of a malevolent spirit. The spirit, unable to withstand Apollonius's presence, retreated. Throughout his travels, wherever he went, extraordinary events followed him. The encyclopedic sources say the following about Neo-Pythagoreanism. The life of Apollonius reads as a portrait of the typical Neo-Pythagorean saint, the ascetic, the model of piety and devotion. He possessed extraordinary powers. He drove out evil spirits and, according to the sources, restored those who had passed. Pay attention to the exact wording in the source text. He cast out devils and raised those who had passed. He drove out evil spirits and restored the departed. This is an extraordinarily powerful statement for an encyclopedia entry. Encyclopedia authors typically avoid exaggeration, but when it comes to Apollonius, they have no choice but to relay the sources. The same source adds something more. All of these miracles positioned Apollonius between the gods and men, not fully a man, not fully a god, somewhere in between, a divine man. This concept was called the Theos Anir, the divine man. This is a specific category, a figure who carries the power of the gods but lives in a human body, not a god who descends fully into the mortal realm, and not a mortal who merely prays to the gods, but something in between, a bridge, a translator between two worlds. And in the 1st century, both Apollonius and Jesus were placed in exactly this category by their respective followers. Now compare with the miracles of Jesus. In the biblical narratives, Jesus opened the eyes of those unable to see. He healed lepers. He drove out malevolent spirits. And Lazarus, who had been in the tomb for 4 days, he called, and Lazarus came out. He walked on water. He calmed the storm. He fed thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish. 2 men, the same century, the same kinds of miracles, the same crowds, the same awe, healing, driving out evil spirits, the return of those who had departed. The list overlaps almost perfectly. But there is a difference, a fundamental difference. The miracles of Apollonius were presented not to establish a belief system, but as tangible proof of wisdom. He did not present himself as a prophet. He did not found a new religion. He did not leave behind a new book. He was a philosopher, and his miracles were evidence of the philosopher's power to affect the world with wisdom. But his followers carried him beyond the philosophers. Human nature is like this. The people who witness miracles turn the philosopher into a saint. According to the sources, after Apollonius's departure from the physical world, temples were built in his name, statues were erected, oracle centers were established in his honor. He became a deified figure in the Roman Empire. The encyclopedic sources record this process as deification, and this is a very important point. If you were to compare the number of people who had heard the name of Jesus on the streets of Rome in the 1st century with the number who had heard the name of Apollonius, according to academic sources, Apollonius was far ahead. The Jesus movement was still a small minority. Apollonius was one of the most known names in the empire. But fame alone guarantees nothing. In the ancient world, fame was often the harbinger of danger, because the man who wins the love of the people becomes the enemy of those in power. To understand this, we need to move to the next chapter of the story, because the fame of Apollonius was about to bring him face to face with the most dangerous man in Rome. As the fame of Apollonius grew, the powerful men of Rome began to grow uneasy.
To understand this unease, you need to know the political climate of first-century Rome. The empire was a dictatorship, but a brilliant one. Roads, bridges, arena spectacles, trade networks. In return for all of this, only one thing was demanded: absolute loyalty. And anyone who won the hearts of the people, whether a general, a senator, or a philosopher, was seen as a potential threat. Apollonius wasn't just a sage, he was also outspoken on political matters. According to the sources, he criticized tyranny. He spoke of the value of freedom. The fact that the public listened to a philosopher this closely was something that would not escape the palace's notice. Emperor Domitian, one of the most paranoid rulers in Roman history, a man who had even his own senators executed, who saw conspiracies in every corner. Domitian viewed anyone who could potentially rival him as a threat, and the crowds gathering around Apollonius did not escape his attention. According to the sources, Apollonius was arrested and brought to Rome. He was put on trial before Domitian. The charge was vague: inciting the public, sorcery, political conspiracy. Philostratus implies that the real reason behind the charges was Apollonius's popularity. Domitian's fear was clear: this man can lead the people, and a man who can lead the people might one day shake the throne. Here, we need to pause for a moment and examine Rome's concept of sorcery. In Roman law, sorcery was a serious offense, but its definition was vague. It could encompass virtually any claim of extraordinary power. This made it a perfect weapon for those in authority. Saying, "This man performed miracles," could, depending on the situation, either make someone a saint or a condemned man. Apollonius had fallen right on that thin line. And here, the story reaches its most dramatic point. Philostratus narrates Apollonius defended himself in court, but his defense was not a plea, it was an attempt to teach. He turned to the emperor and said that wisdom was superior to power, that freedom could not be chained. You can imprison a philosopher, he said, but you cannot imprison his ideas. Philostratus relays this scene with extraordinary drama. He describes the expression on Domitian's face, a ruler going back and forth between anger and unease. And he emphasizes the calm of Apollonius, chained, probably exhausted, but showing not a single trace of fear. Compare this scene with the trial of Jesus before Pilate. In the biblical narratives, when Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus responds, "You say so." The man who appears powerless actually holds the moral high ground. Pilate is uneasy. There is something about this man, something beyond his authority to judge. The scene between Apollonius and Domitian carries nearly the same dynamic. The man in power is intimidated by the chained man standing before him. And then, according to the sources, Apollonius vanished from the courtroom, from his chains, gone in an instant. Philostratus narrates this scene like a theatrical finale, a flash of light, a moment of confusion, and empty chains. The guards looked at each other. The emperor looked at the empty space where the philosopher had stood. And in that silence, something shifted. Because a man who can disappear from the most secure building in the empire is either the greatest fraud in history or something that the chains of Rome cannot hold. Some commentators say this account is Philostratus's literary exaggeration,
But notice, Philostratus is writing this biography on the commission of an empress, so it is unlikely to be entirely fabricated. At that time, everyone knew Apollonius and his story. A completely false narrative would have destroyed Philostratus's reputation.
There are historians who try to explain this rationally. Perhaps Apollonius's supporters smuggled him out, or perhaps Domitian quietly released him because executing him would have amplified the legend among the public. Roman rulers understood this dynamic well. When you ban someone, you make them a hero. Perhaps Apollonius secretly left Italy and reappeared in another city. According to the sources, he was later seen in Ephesus and various cities outside of Rome. But the version told by his followers was very different. And what matters for history is not what actually happened, but what was told. Because narratives shape facts, and facts shape the past. He ascended, they said, and one day he will return. Read those sentences again. He ascended, he will return. Sound familiar? After the crucifixion of Jesus, the biblical narratives tell us he ascended to heaven and will one day return. In the letters of the Apostle Paul, this was the most fundamental expectation of the early Christian communities. Jesus would return. And this expectation transformed into a theology within decades and into a civilization within centuries. And here are the followers of Apollonius, in the same empire, in the same century, using nearly the exact same words for their own master. The same hope, the same expectation, the same words. 2,000 years apart from us, and yet the echo is unmistakable. Celestial birth, miracles, the power to heal, an unjust trial, a mysterious departure from the physical world, ascension to the heavens, a promise of return. Read that list again. 7 parallels, 7 of them, for 2 men who lived in the same empire in the 1st century, 7 precise overlaps. A coincidence? 2 coincidences might be acceptable, 3 coincidences would be noteworthy, but 7? The list is no longer a coincidence, and explaining what this list means has become a puzzle that the academic world has been trying to solve for 2 centuries. This is where one of the most contentious debates in the academic world begins. For centuries, scholars have been working on 2 theories to explain these parallels. The first theory says this: the narratives that formed around Jesus, celestial birth, miracles, departure from the physical world, ascension to the heavens, were actually drawing from patterns that already existed in the Roman world. Apollonius was the most well-known representative of these patterns, and as the Jesus movement grew in Rome, the narratives about its founder were shaped by the already well-known story of Apollonius. In short, the attributes ascribed to Jesus may actually have been borrowed from the attributes of Apollonius. The second theory argues the reverse. Apollonius was a real historical figure, but when Philostratus wrote the biography in 220 AD, well after the Gospel narratives, he knowingly projected the already strengthened Christian tradition onto Apollonius. So the flow was reversed. The characteristics of Jesus were projected onto Apollonius, not the other way around. The academic view in the sources is clear. The first theory is more likely. Why? Because Apollonius was far more well known in his own time than Jesus. This is a critical detail. In the Roman Empire, people knew Apollonius. Those who knew Jesus were a small minority, members of a modest movement in the eastern reaches of the empire. Transferring the characteristics of a widely known figure to a lesser-known one is the natural direction of information flow. The reverse, attributing characteristics of someone no one knew to someone everyone knew, is logically harder to explain. To make this concrete, think of an analogy. Imagine that 2,000 years from now, someone discovers another scientist who lived in the same era as Einstein and made similar discoveries. They would quickly ask, did this man take his ideas from Einstein? Because Einstein is known, the other is not. But what if that unknown man had been more famous than Einstein in his own time? Then the question would reverse. The Apollonius-Jesus relationship is exactly this. But there is a third possibility, and perhaps the most unsettling one. Perhaps no one copied anyone. To understand this third possibility, you need to imagine the spiritual atmosphere of the first-century Roman world. In this period, dozens of cults coexisted in Rome. Each had its own holy man figure. Each had its miracles, birth narratives, and stories of departure from the physical world. Mithras, Dionysus, Osiris, Attis, Adonis, all fit similar patterns. Perhaps the first-century Roman world already knew what a holy man was supposed to look like. There was a template, a celestial birth, extraordinary powers, words of wisdom, an unjust trial, and an ending that transcends the physical world. This template preceded both men. It was the shared heritage of the ancient world. Both were simply different interpretations of the same cultural pattern. Why is this third theory unsettling? Because it questions the uniqueness claims of both Jesus and Apollonius. If both fit a pre-existing template, then neither Jesus' story is entirely unique, nor Apollonius' story entirely original. Both have their roots in the same soil. In the Roman Empire, people knew what to expect when they heard holy man, and both Jesus and Apollonius met that expectation, because that expectation was the product of a tradition that existed before either of them. The question is, if neither of them created the template, who did? This question is one of the most fundamental questions in modern religious studies, and its answer extends far beyond the individual stories of Jesus and Apollonius. That answer is hidden in the spiritual climate of the first-century Roman world.
We will return to the answer to this question shortly. But first, I need to tell you about the moment when the stories of these two men collided in the most unexpected way. The most fascinating part of the story begins approximately 250 years after both men departed the physical world. And this chapter, in a sense, explains why this entire story matters. Around 303 AD, a Roman governor, Hierocles, wrote a book. Hierocles was no ordinary governor. He was the administrator of the province of Bithynia and also an intellectual figure. His book had a single purpose: to prove that Apollonius was superior to Jesus. Hierocles' argument was clear and systematic. You Christians declare Jesus to be divine. You say he performed miracles. But look, Apollonius did the same things, and even more. And the life of Apollonius is far better documented. Philostratus wrote a detailed biography, hundreds of pages, specific dates, specific locations, names of witnesses.
And what do you have? 4 narratives that don't agree with each other: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even those contradict one another. This was the first systematic Jesus comparison in history, the first known formal text to directly question the uniqueness of Jesus by comparing him to another historical figure. And its timing was no coincidence. Hierocles wrote this book precisely during a period when Christians were rapidly gaining strength in Rome, and pagan circles were becoming uneasy about this rise. Hierocles' purpose was not merely intellectual, it was political. He was striking the Jesus movement at the weakest point of its armor, its claim to uniqueness. And the Christian world did not remain silent. Eusebius, one of the Church Fathers, considered the founder of Christian historiography, penned a counterbook. Eusebius's argument was this: the miracles of Apollonius may not have been real. The biography by Philostratus may have been exaggerated or entirely fabricated. And in any case, if Apollonius truly performed extraordinary things, their source was not divine, it was dark forces. Apollonius was not a sage, he was a sorcerer. Notice, Eusebius couldn't say Apollonius didn't exist. He couldn't erase him from history, because everyone knew him. The man had temples across the empire. His biography had been read by thousands. His story was part of the cultural fabric of the Roman world. What Eusebius did was more subtle. He questioned the source of his powers. The miracles of Jesus were divine. The miracles of Apollonius were deceptive. The same action, a different interpretation. It was one of the most brilliant rhetorical strategies in the history of religious debate. You don't deny the phenomenon, you reframe its meaning. But the encyclopedic sources drop an interesting note about Eusebius. Even when Philostratus was writing the biography, he may have been drawing parallels with the authority derived from the founders of the Christians, just as Hierocles would do 80 years later. In other words, the sources suggest that this rivalry existed long before Hierocles. It may have even been present in Philostratus's time. This debate resonated seriously in Rome's intellectual circles during the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Apollonius-Jesus comparison was not a parlor discussion, it was a real conflict with political consequences. Don't think of this as an abstract academic debate. This argument played out in Rome's streets, its assemblies, its palaces. Hierocles was a governor, a statesman. Eusebius was a church father, a religious authority. Both represented the political forces of their respective sides. This was a war of ideas, but the prize for the winner was an empire. Because the Roman Empire was in the midst of a total transition. A massive transformation was underway from pagan culture to a monotheistic empire. And in this transformation, which figure would be accepted as the true holy man was not merely a theological question, it was political. This was a moment when a civilization was forced to choose between the old world and the new.
Apollonius was the last hero of the pagan world. Jesus was the sole candidate to become the founder of the new world. The final act of a 2,000-year war was about to begin, and the victor of this war would be determined not by which of the two men was real, but by which one had a more powerful structure behind him. And then an emperor made his decision. 312 AD, Constantine becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire and places Christianity under the protection of the state. History thus passes a turning point, one from which there would be no return. Constantine's decision was not merely the rise of a religion, it was simultaneously the end of a world. For 400 years, the Roman Empire had maintained a pluralistic religious structure. Hundreds of cults, hundreds of gods, hundreds of temples coexisting side by side. A Roman could pray to Mithras in the morning, visit a temple of Isis in the afternoon, and attend a Pythagorean gathering in the evening. This pluralism was the soil that allowed figures like Apollonius to thrive. Constantine dried up that soil. The pluralism of centuries came to an end with a single decision. Pagan temples were first ignored, then had their properties transferred to the state, and finally shut down. The priests of the old cults lost their power. Lands dedicated to temples were transferred to the church, and in Rome's holy man repertoire, there was now room for only one name. What happened to Apollonius? It happened step by step, not all at once, but with determination. The greatest erasures in history don't happen overnight. They work slowly over generations. First, his temples were closed. The oracle centers established in Apollonius's name, places to which people once traveled hundreds of miles to consult, places where the sick came hoping for healing and the desperate came seeking guidance, fell silent. The doors were shut. The priests were dispersed. The incense stopped burning. His statues were removed or smashed. Some were converted into building materials for Christian churches, an ironic end. The very stones that once bore his likeness were repurposed to build walls dedicated to the man whose story had replaced his own. The biography by Philostratus was not destroyed, but there was no longer any reason for anyone to read it. The education system had changed. Now children were reading the church fathers, not Apollonius. Now theologians were respected, not philosophers. Apollonius was not actively banned, and perhaps even more effectively, he was forgotten. If you ban something, you remind people of it, but if you forget it, you truly eliminate it. As the centuries passed, this forgetting deepened. Throughout the Middle Ages, the name of Apollonius appeared in only two contexts: as the false miracle worker example of Christian theologians, Eusebius's legacy, or as the secret sage figure of esoteric circles. Mainstream historiography almost entirely ignored him. He was not taught in universities. He had no place in popular culture. For 15 centuries, silence. To grasp the scale of this silence, let me make a comparison. You know Socrates, you know Plato, you know Aristotle. All three lived centuries before Apollonius, but their works were copied, preserved, and taught, because the Christian world did not see them as a threat. In some cases, it even used them to support its own theology. But Apollonius, he was directly compared to Jesus. He was a rival, and rivals had to be forgotten. And so, one of the most recognized names of the Roman Empire, a man who had followers, temples, miracles attributed to him, who had become a legend among philosophers, whom emperors feared, was almost completely erased from history.
But the story of Jesus continued to grow. The Gospels were copied, multiplied, translated into dozens of languages. Every copy, every translation carried the story one step further. Every new community, every new church brought the name of Jesus to one more geography. The Church Fathers processed the life, words, and miracles of Jesus within a theological system. Councils were convened at Nicaea in 325, at Constantinople in 381, at Chalcedon in 451. Dogmas were established, heresies were defined, the boundaries of faith were drawn. Every generation passed the story of Jesus to the next,
not just orally, but institutionally. And this is the key difference. The story of Jesus became the story of an institution, the story of a church, a state, a civilization. The story of Apollonius remained the story of a philosopher, and stories without institutions fade with time. Within a few centuries, a name once known by only a handful of people in the outskirts of Rome had become the most recognized figure in the world. Two men had done the same things, the same kinds of miracles, the same kinds of teachings, the same kind of ending. But behind one stood an institutional structure growing with imperial support, church, councils, dogmas, sacred texts, a system designed to preserve, to multiply, to replicate itself across continents and centuries. Behind the other stood a school of philosophy, one that gradually weakened, its students scattered, eventually absorbed into Neoplatonism, a system built on the brilliance of individuals, not the machinery of institutions. What is the word of a philosophy school against the decisions of an empire? What is the voice of a single brilliant teacher against the organized power of an institution that controls education, law, land, and the very definition of truth? The fate of Apollonius is the answer to that question. The winner writes his history, and the loser, no matter how real, is buried in silence.
Today, walk into any history of religions class at any university in the world. Repeat the experiment that scholar Bart Ehrman has been conducting. Describe the life of a man who lived in the 1st century. Celestial birth, miracles, an unjust trial, followers proclaiming an ascension to the heavens, and ask, "Who am I talking about?" Everyone in the class will give the same answer, and that answer will be wrong. 2,000 years later, this experiment still works, and that fact alone should give us pause, because for 2,000 years only one story was told, the other was silenced. And the silenced story was so effectively erased that today, outside of academic circles, almost no one has heard of Apollonius. The erasure was so complete that even well-educated people, people who know about Socrates, Plato, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, draw a complete blank when they hear the name Apollonius of Tyana. To grasp the scale of this irony, think of it this way. There was a time when across every corner of the Roman Empire, from Spain to Egypt, from Greece to Syria, the name of Apollonius was known. He had temples, he had statues, he had oracle centers. People traveled great distances just to see him. And today, zero, completely zero. Say Apollonius of Tyana to 1,000 people on the street. Perhaps one will know, and that person is probably a professor of religious history. What does this experiment tell us? It shows the greatest irony of 2,000 years of history. The man who was once more famous than Jesus is today almost completely unknown. And nearly all of the attributes we consider unique about Jesus, celestial birth, miracles, healing, driving out evil spirits, an unjust trial, a mysterious departure from the physical world, ascension to the heavens, a promise of return, were actually being told about another man who lived in the same era, in the same geography. If you go to Tyana, today's Kemerhisar, where Apollonius was born, you won't find a grand monument or museum greeting you. A few ancient foundation ruins, a flat Anatolian plain, a quiet town. We're not even sure those ruins are directly related to Apollonius because archaeological work has been limited. Consider this. In Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, there is a massive church, the Church of the Nativity, one of the oldest continuously operating churches in the world. Millions visit every year. In Nazareth, where he lived, there is the Church of the Annunciation. In Jerusalem, where his earthly journey is said to have ended, there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Every step has been marked, every stop memorialized. But at the birthplace of Apollonius, not even a sign. The place where the empire's most famous man was once born is today a void. And this void is the most concrete proof of how history works. The encyclopedic sources write this about Apollonius: he stood between the gods and men. Not fully a god, not fully a man, a philosophical saint, a model of wisdom, and one of the most respected figures in the Roman world, until another story dethroned him. Between the gods and men, this expression could also be used for Jesus. In Christian theology, Jesus is fully God and fully man, two natures, one person. The language the encyclopedia uses for Apollonius is nearly identical, two different traditions using nearly the same definition for two different figures. This too shows the power of the template. The question is no longer, was Apollonius real or was Jesus real? Both were real, both lived, both walked in the same empire, both passed through the same roads, stood in the same temples, shared their teachings under the same sky.
And both had followers. Both had miracles attributed to them. Both were proclaimed divine. Both were put on trial. Both departed the physical world in a mysterious manner. What's the difference? Not in their stories, not in what their stories were. The question is, of two men who lived nearly identical lives in the same era, on the same lands, why did one settle at the center of human history, while the other was reduced to an encyclopedia footnote? To seek the answer to this question, we need to descend to the final layer of the story. Perhaps the answer lies beyond the individual stories of both men. Perhaps the question is not who copied whom, but what was the force that shaped them both. Neo-Pythagoreanism, the tradition to which Apollonius belonged, was a rising movement in the Roman world from the last centuries BC onward. But it was not a movement in isolation. It was part of a much larger trend in the Roman world. In the 1st century, Rome was experiencing a spiritual explosion. People were unsatisfied with the state's official religion, cold, ritualistic, offering no personal connection. They were searching for something deeper, personal salvation, life after the physical journey, direct contact with the divine. The core belief of this movement was the universe is eternal, the human soul does not perish, and the soul travels between different bodies, a concept called transmigration. Transmigration, the changing of bodies by the soul, explained everything in the Pythagorean world. Why didn't they eat meat? Because that animal might once have been human. Why did they wear linen? Because an animal product was a vessel of a soul. Why 5 years of silence? Because the soul needed to listen, not to speak. All of these disciplines served a single purpose: to purify the soul, release it from the cycle, and bring it closer to the divine. From this perspective, the Neo-Pythagoreans followed a strict life discipline. They rejected animal sacrifice. They stayed away from rituals involving sacred essence. They believed the divine should be honored not with physical substance, but with wisdom. They avoided meat. They preferred an ascetic life. And they expected the most important figure among them, the one we might call the saint, to possess certain qualities: an extraordinary birth, celestial signs, the power to heal, a life beyond physical desires, and ultimately an ending that transcends the limits of the physical world. This is not the portrait of a person, it is the description of a template. And the same template also appears in the mystery religions of Rome during the same period. The mystery religions, unlike the state's official cults, promised personal salvation.
initiation ceremonies, secret rituals, and direct contact with the divine, everything the official religion could not provide. In the cult of Mithras, the most widespread faith in the Roman army, the divine figure is born from a rock and shepherds bear witness. In Egypt, in the narrative of Isis and Osiris, a god figure who departs the physical world and returns has existed for 1,000 years. Osiris is divided into parts. Isis reassembles him, and Osiris returns as the ruler of the other world. In the cult of Dionysus, the suffering and rebirth of the god was central to the rituals. In the cult of Attis, the god would come back to life every spring after departing the physical world. Do you see a pattern? Birth, suffering, departure from the physical world, return. The same arc repeated across different civilizations, different languages, different centuries, but always with the same essential structure. This narrative pattern existed centuries before both Apollonius and Jesus. Mithras, Osiris, Dionysus, Attis, all were different versions of this same pattern. The details change, the names change, the rituals change, but the skeleton of the story remains remarkably consistent.
The sources summarize the situation as follows. Apollonius became the subject of a romance, meaning his real life, even in his own time, had begun to transform into a legend, and legends conform to the patterns of the culture in which they live. For a Roman, holy man meant specific things. The birth had to be extraordinary. Miracles had to be performed. The physical world had to be unable to contain him. This expectation shaped the stories of both Apollonius and Jesus. The first-century Roman world already knew what a holy man was supposed to look like. A celestial birth and superhuman powers were an expectation, not a surprise. Any holy man candidate living in that era was expected to fit this pattern. If you weren't performing miracles, if celestial signs weren't confirming you, you wouldn't be considered sacred. That was the template. And notice, this template existed before Christianity, before Apollonius. It even existed before Pythagoras. It had begun in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, with the sun deity departing the physical world once a year and being reborn. The cycle of disappearance and return was written into the oldest myths of human civilization. The seasons turning, the crops dying and rising in every season, the sun setting and dawning again. The concept of the divine man may be different versions of one of humanity's oldest stories, the story of something sacred that departs and returns over and over in every culture that has ever looked at the sky and wondered. And this is precisely why the fact that the stories of Apollonius and Jesus so closely resemble each other may not be a matter of copying, it may be a matter of pattern. Both were different interpretations of the same cultural template of the Roman world. Two figures who gave different answers to the same expectations, but who spoke the same language. The difference was not in their stories. The difference was in the structures behind their stories. Behind one stood a school of philosophy, one that gradually weakened, its students scattered, eventually absorbed into Neoplatonism. The encyclopedic sources clearly record this process. In the time of Apollonius, Neo-Pythagoreanism was a vibrant movement, but a century later it was absorbed into Neoplatonism. Apollonius became the subject of a romance, not a real teaching, but a legend.
and behind the other stood sacred texts, church fathers, imperial decrees, and a massive institutional structure built through centuries of effort. A school of philosophy cannot withstand history, but a church with the support of a state writes history. And perhaps the most important lesson of this entire story is this: history is not a record of truth. History is a collection of narratives selected by power. And a powerful narrative doesn't just defeat its rivals, it makes them forgotten. And so another night has passed with the evidence. Two men, the same century, the same empire, nearly the same life, but very different endings. One became the most recognized figure in human history. He settled at the center of the faith of billions. Temples, cathedrals, civilizations were built in his name. His story is told every day, in every corner of the world, in every language.
The other, the man who was once more famous, more well-known, more widely spoken of, was reduced to an encyclopedia footnote. His birthplace is today a quiet Anatolian town. No one has heard his name. No one knows his story. On the flat plain of Gümüşler, the only thing remaining from the most famous man of 2,000 years ago is a few foundation stones. History doesn't always remember the most righteous. It remembers the most told. And this may be the most uncomfortable truth of all. We like to believe that the stories that survived did so because they were truer, or better, or more deserving. But the evidence suggests something far more unsettling. Stories survive when they have institutional power behind them. Truth on its own is not enough. And perhaps this raises the most unsettling question of all. Who else was forgotten? What other figures, once known by millions, once honored with temples, once surrounded by stories, are today buried in complete silence? How many Apolloniuses are there in the depths of history, men and women who once changed the world, who made emperors tremble, who were known by millions, but were then erased from the winner's history? Apollonius reminds us of this. The history we know consists only of the stories that continued to be told. Stories that stopped being told, no matter how real, vanish. And the greatest irony of history is that sometimes it's not the truth itself that's decisive, it's the power behind the truth. Two men, the same sky, the same empire, the same roads, nearly the same life story, but one became God, and the other became a footnote. And for 2,000 years, almost no one asked this question. Tonight, we ask that question. But the archive has not yet closed, and perhaps one night, a night like this, someone will open a forgotten encyclopedia entry, see a photograph of the ruins at Gümüşler, and ask, who was this man? And that question is enough to break 2,000 years of silence.